Thank you all very much for coming to the event today, which is the intersection of the Internet of Things, smart communities, and Next Generation 911. My name is Patrick Halley. I'm the Executive Director of the Next Generation 911 Institute. A little bit about the Institute for those of you who are unfamiliar. We are a 501c3 not-for-profit organization made up of public safety associations, public safety professionals, and industry leaders in the 911 and emergency communication space. Our mission is to assist the Next Generation 911 Caucus, which I will talk about briefly, in educating members of Congress and policymakers and their staff on important issues and opportunities in the 911 emergency communication space. We've been around since 2003, so this is our 14th year of existence. And our purpose is really to do this, bring together people like you all into a room to talk about the issues that are challenging the 911 system and that are opportunities for the 911 system. So our goal is to be educational in nature. We're not an advocacy organization, but it is our pleasure to bring people like you together to talk about these issues. And the Next Gen 911 Caucus, as I mentioned, was founded in 2003. On the Senate side, we are chaired by Senator Klobuchar and Senator Burr. On the House side, and they were there actually from the beginning, we are chaired by Representative Shimkus and Representative Eshoo. And we are the only bipartisan, bicameral caucus dedicated exclusively to 911 emergency communications issues, and we now have over 75 members. So today, it's my pleasure to introduce Representative Susan Brooks, who is a recent member of the Next Generation 911 Caucus, and we're delighted to have her. Congresswoman Brooks represents the 5th District of Indiana, which spans 8 urban, suburban, and rural counties in central Indiana, including the north side of Indianapolis. She currently serves on the House Energy and Commerce Committee and is a member of the Communications and Technology Subcommittee. Through her membership on the Energy and Commerce Committee, she's working on public safety, mental health, substance abuse, biodefense, and Medicaid reform issues. And as chairwoman of the House Committee on Ethics, she also works with her colleagues to restore confidence in Congress. Her strong background in both the public and private sectors includes experience as a proven difference maker in areas such as public safety, homeland security, counterterrorism, and economic development. Before joining the House of Representatives, Congresswoman Brooks served as Senior Vice President and General Counsel for Ivy Tech Community College. And before that, in 2001, President George W. Bush appointed Representative Brooks as attorney for the Southern District of Indiana. She also served as Deputy Mayor of Indianapolis during the Steve Goldman administration, where she provided oversight of public safety operations and drove community dialogue on vital civic issues. Over her tenure, she managed police, fire, and emergency response efforts while serving on boards related to criminal justice, community corrections, violence reductions, and race relations. So as you can tell, Representative Brooks has a long history supporting the public safety community. Earlier this year, Chairman Blackburn announced that she is heading up the Communications Subcommittee's examination of Next Generation 911 issues. As a new member of the Next Gen 911 Caucus and a leader on public safety issues, we are delighted that she will be leading the charge alongside the Next Generation Caucus co-chairs and fellow caucus members. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce Representative Susan Brooks.
Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. Thanks to technology, I took off from Indianapolis just a couple of hours ago, and here we are. And so it's great to have landed on time and to have made your luncheon today. And I want to thank you, Patrick, for that nice introduction, as you could tell, when he said I've been engaged in these issues of public safety and emergency communications, and then as he was going through my bio, it's like, I'm just old, okay? I've been around a long time, and I have been, my first time into public service was as Deputy Mayor of Indianapolis, and I was asked to be very focused as a Deputy Mayor on public safety, and it is really because of experts like yourselves, particularly those of you up here on the panel, I'm looking forward to hearing from you, that I learned so very much. And I am excited to be a part of the Energy and Commerce Communications and Technology Subcommittee, and because I'm a former Deputy Mayor and U.S. Attorney, right after 9/11, I've just been involved and really value all that you all do. I want to thank the NG911 Institute for organizing the panel today and for inviting me to speak briefly about the intersection between the Internet of Things, which I'm learning so much more about, smart communities, and next-gen 911. I'm excited to say that last week, AT&T launched the 5G Evolution Network in Indianapolis. So we are one of those new sites, a critical piece in the puzzle in our city as our city moves toward greater connectivity and continues to attract leading tech companies. So for instance, you may not know, we had a company called ExactTarget. It was just acquired in the last couple of years by Salesforce. So we are the Salesforce headquarters for the middle of the country. And we're working to really expand our tech companies in central Indiana. And we're also home of the Indianapolis 500, and so we like to be on the cutting edge of everything automobile. And so we are, the type of community that is going to be focused someday on self-driving cars and on all of those technologies that we know we're on the verge of. But we know Indianapolis is able to be a test site for 5G because of our state legislature, quite frankly. Our state legislature, and we have to remember, this is not just about the federal government, and you all know better than most, it's also state legislatures and it's local officials. Very, very involved in these types of decisions. And it was our state legislature, our General Assembly, that embraced innovation, recently passed legislation that empowers the deployment of those small cell devices, which is what allowed us to bring 5G to Indianapolis. Let me tell you, it wasn't without controversy because putting those small cell devices up in neighborhoods and places where communities had not had them before, but I want to applaud our legislature and our local officials that embrace this and work through the differences. But we know that empowering that small cell technology is just one of the many components of deploying 21st century broadband infrastructure. And so while I represent urban Indianapolis, much of my district is also rural, and in fact may not experience that same high-speed broadband that we enjoy in Indianapolis and the suburbs. In fact, 1 out of 6 Hoosiers live in an area without any broadband access at all. And so that is still a challenge for our country, is identifying those unserved areas. And I know that's hard to imagine when you're sitting in Washington, D.C., that there are places, but I will tell you, I was driving from a lake yesterday in northern Indiana, and many times going through the countrysides of Indiana, I had no service. I was in the middle of, cornfields and some hills, and suddenly, and I was talking to my mother-in-law, trying to be a good daughter-in-law, and checking in with her, and I lost her 3 times, and I'm like, okay, I'll call you when I get out on the highway. And so we do have to remember that this still exists in many places in the country, including Indiana. So identifying those truly unserved areas is a top priority as we explore broadband deployment. Accurate data collection and reliable up-to-date mapping of that broadband coverage is key to ensuring we fulfill those under and unserved areas. I have to tell you, the other things that are really exciting for communities like Indianapolis and other communities around the country are the notion of being smart cities and thinking about what the Internet of Things is going to bring to us. It's estimated that 80 billion different devices, Internet of Things, connected devices, are expected by 2020. 80 billion. And so we're just in a whole new world. We truly are. And so the challenge for us as policymakers is how do we make sure that our country's the best place for innovators to create and maintain a business, and that the new technologies that we bring on can be brought online safely, quickly, and efficiently. We've got to make sure as policymakers that we're not putting such rigid rules in place that stifles innovation. We want to make sure we're cutting through the red tape and the bureaucracy and not creating more, which we have done in the past as government. We need to make sure those regulations are more like guardrails, not speed bumps, that they are just allowing innovators and companies that are innovating to make sure that the regulations make sense and are not getting in the way. But I have to tell you, it's tough. It's tough with the innovations that you all keep coming up with. is keeping up with the laws and the rules and regulations to keep pace, because once we put something in place, you all are behind, all the way past us with the next technology, and we want to encourage you to keep going. And so that's why we have things like the NG911 caucus, is that we as lawmakers need to be informed so that we can strike that delicate balance between, you know, entrepreneurs and innovation, but also safety, protecting consumers, and things like that. I have to tell you, Marsha Blackburn, as our new Communications and Technology Chair, wants to be very focused on Next Gen 911 and issues like FirstNet. So I'm curious, just out of curiosity, how many of you still have a landline phone in your home or in your apartment? How many of you still have it? Okay, hold them up. Okay, this is kind of generational, sorry folks, but I've got them. Okay, the rest of you do not. Okay, and so think about that. I taught my kids who are now in their mid-20s how to use 911 by going to that landline, because there weren't cell phones when they were little, okay? Or maybe they were just coming on at that time. Well, and I'm still one in my little apartment here in DC. I have a landline. I got one because I am concerned what could happen if anything happened here in DC, okay? And all the networks are jammed. I bet I'll be able to get through that call on that landline. And so I am just one of those old-fashioned people in that way, but it's a backup. I live on my cell phone. I live on that little supercomputer, and that's what our cell phones are. They are supercomputers. That I don't even have a PC in my office. We got rid of my desk in my office. We got rid of, I don't have a PC. I have an iPad and I have a phone, and that's what I live on. But now, with these phones and those capabilities, Next Gen 911 needs to be ready. You all need to be capable. Our communities, whether it's a small rural county or whether it's a large urban area, they have to have the systems in place so that my 27-year-old, if she is calling 911 and wants to send a video file with that, and be able to help law enforcement or be able to help that person who's in distress, that our systems are able to handle that. These are the types of things that we have to be able to, whether it's calls, text, video technology. We heard from Barry Ritter, the executive. Barry is not here, is he? I forgot to ask. He's Indiana's executive director of our 911 system, and he testified before our committee earlier that this is what the capability needs to be. But Indiana is one of only 8 states where you can make a call from a wireless device anywhere in the state and be connected to 911. And that's, of course, if you have service, okay? But we have that technology, and we're only one of 8 states in the entire country. So there are many, many places in the country where you cannot call 911 still. And this is work that we must do and must do together. Because let me just tell you, citizens assume, my constituents presume and assume that whenever they call 911, someone's going to be on the other line to answer, regardless of where they are in the country. And so it's very important. The work that you all is doing is important. I'm looking forward to hearing from these folks up here. And I just want to applaud all of you for being here, being part of this exciting work, because I think that's government's #1 priority is keeping its citizens safe. That's not something the private sector does on its own. We work with the private sector very, very closely to do that. But at the end of the day, the private sector, whether it's the police and the fire, the emergency responders, the citizens who are trying to be a part of that emergency response, that's what we in government need to do, is support that effort and make sure that we have that technology to be able to communicate and make sure we keep our citizens as safe as possible. So with that, would like to kick it off, or if you have a couple of questions, happy to take a couple of questions or comments. And it doesn't have to be about NG911. Yes?
With TRDL, do you have any more specifics, I guess, what the subcommittee may try to do on NG911? There's been some draft legislation in the Senate. Anything legislatively you want to?
Well, I think that the challenge that we have and that many of you have is the funding. And how do we make sure that there is adequate funding to support the technologies and to support the build out of NG911 systems so that we can make sure that our country does have full coverage. So I think those are some of the issues that I think we need to dig into. But again, the technology and the making sure that we are not getting in the way of bringing in new technologies, which that's often our rules and regulations and laws we pass often have to do with old technologies, and how do we keep up with the new technologies. And that's what I hope to hear from today, so we can take back some of those ideas. Anybody else? Okay, terrific, thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to just provide a very brief presentation just to kind of, as a discussion starter on the topics that we're going to discuss today, and then I'm going to introduce my panelists. We have a great panel here of industry and public safety and government leaders who all bring different areas of expertise to this discussion. So some of you have heard me do a version of this spiel before, so bear with me. But in a nutshell, we're at a very interesting time in our country where technology is rapidly changing, as Congressman Brooks described, on the consumer side and on the public safety side. And it's sort of an inflection point in which we have a really great opportunity to make sure that those two technology transitions happen simultaneously in a way that benefits citizens and in a way that benefits responders and the public in general. And so just sort of where we are versus where we've come from. Next year will be the 50th anniversary of the first 911 call. It was made in Haleyville, Alabama in 1968. And obviously that was not on a wireless phone, and it certainly was not an iPad. It was a landline telephone, and it was the first time that you could dial the 3 digits 911 and reach local law enforcement. And you didn't have to know the number of the police department or the fire department. You just called the 3 digits 911, and you got access to somebody who could help you during your emergency. There was no data with it. There was no address with it. There was no callback number with it, but you did get help. You got to the right place. Over time, we modernized that system to include a callback number and to include an address, which was, of course, a simpler prospect when it was a fixed location that didn't move. And that's been an extraordinarily successful system and still is. Starting in the late 90s and all throughout the early 2000s, we updated that system to be able to handle wireless 911 calls, including the estimated location of where that wireless call was coming from. The tremendous benefits, of course, of cell phones and mobile technology are that you have your phone with you wherever you are. The challenge, of course, is locating that device when it's moving and it's mobile. But we've updated the existing legacy 911 system, which is still based on that traditional telephone network, to handle wireless. We then, in the mid-2000s, updated the rules in our system to be able to handle voice over IP 911 calls. And just recently, we've, as a result of FCC rules, we've now enabled the possibility of texting to 911. My understanding is that we're probably at about 20% of 911 centers at last count that are currently capable of receiving text messages to 911. The history has been amazing. It is a wildly successful system that we have, but it's also very limited. It is still, today, in the vast majority of locations, a system in which an individual makes a phone call and uses their voice to communicate what their emergency is. It is not a system that is kept up with the FaceTime world that we live in, the modern real-time streaming video world that we live in. We have people that are streaming real-time video of emergencies on Facebook. We don't have that same capability to stream the real-time video directly into 911, which would probably be more helpful during an emergency than putting it just on Facebook for the public. So we're on the cusp of modernizing our 911 system to be able to take advantage of, and go to the next slide, please, to be able to take advantage of all forms of voice, video, and data, whether it's text, whether it's an image of a crime scene or an emergency, or whether it's video. These are the things we do every day: sharing images, sharing pictures, sharing real-time video as we have conversations with friends and family. We're not today yet able to take advantage of that and in a way that we can utilize it to communicate directly with 911. That's what this transition to NG911 is about. It's also about the underlying 911 system and bringing that system into an IP architecture that is more resilient and redundant. So there's also benefits on the public safety system side as well, not just the consumer side. Where we're also at this time, as I said, is first responders, responders in the field are also upgrading their technology, taking advantage of real-time video and the availability of an increasing amount of data. And another point here is it's not just data that we are producing ourselves using our devices, there are also an increasing amount of data sources that are being produced by machines all around us, all the time. And people are now trying to figure out how to harness that data for business purposes, for government purposes, and it's incumbent upon all of us to think about how to harness that data for emergency response as well. So just in a nutshell, you can think about it in connected cars. Vehicles are producing a substantial amount of data now that is used for all kinds of purposes. How do we do it for public safety? Connected health. Connected health is a major industry. I'll talk about that in a second. And not just on our person, but also our homes are increasingly connected, producing all kinds of information. And all of that makes up a connected community. And communities across this country, and we'll talk about this, are trying to get smarter and utilize data to help manage their resources and to improve the lives of the citizens that they serve. Next slide. So just a couple of statistics to sort of start the discussion. Connected things in North America. Today, 5.9 billion. Estimates suggest that by the end of the decade, that'll be up at least to over 7.5 billion. Congresswoman Brooks talked about global statistics of 80 billion. The point is, there's just no telling how many devices are going to be connected to the internet in the future, and already are. Next slide. On the car side, connected cars will generate a flood of data. Today, we already have systems where cars are producing information about crashes, for example, where they are, how fast the car was going, whether it rolled, did the airbags deploy, all that kind of stuff. Today, we're not really in a position to be able to share that data directly with responders or with 911. The data's there. We just haven't successfully interfaced with the 911 system and emergency responders. But there is a substantial amount of data that are coming out of vehicles now than ever before, including live video in the car. And so you can imagine all that data, how do we take advantage of it? Next. Same thing with homes. Modern homes as they're being built, we're not just thinking about how to wire up our homes for really good speaker systems to have surround sound throughout the house. We're also looking at other forms of sensors in the house that could potentially be producing data about the environment around the people who are in that house, which can be useful during emergencies. Next. And then on the connected health side, there's opportunities both for the consumer and responders. On the consumer side, lots of people are now wearing Fitbits or smart watches, which are able to monitor the vitals of a person. You could imagine somebody having a heart attack, and it would be really helpful if we could also take advantage of the data that's being monitored on that person's watch. I can't believe I'm saying that, but it's true. And the ability to take advantage of that data for emergency response would be quite useful. Similarly with responders. We're increasingly now looking at outfitting firemen and police officers as they're out there doing their jobs, being able to measure their vitals and their heart rate and their temperature, and being able to take advantage of that information during an emergency. And similarly with implants as well. And all of that through sensors and cameras and things that are measuring gunshots, for example, out in our communities, and monitoring traffic and weather conditions. There's a substantial amount of information as communities are increasingly connected. And so our objective is to try to figure out how to take advantage of that for emergency response, and that's what we're going to discuss with this roundtable. Go ahead. So to help have that discussion, I want to introduce the panel in alphabetical order, not in order of importance. Jeff Brugman is Vice President of Public Policy and Deputy Chief Privacy Officer at AT&T. We're also joined by Matt Gerst, who's the Director of Regulatory Affairs at CTIA. Ray Lear, a retired fire chief of Baltimore and former Maryland State Interoperability Director. We also have Bill Murtka. Bill Murtka is Senior Project Manager and Planning Consultant for Motorola Solutions. And last but not least, Dr. Sokoo Ri, who is the Associate Director of Cyber Physical Systems Program at NIST. So, Kareem, how could I forget you? Sorry, Karima Holmes, who's the Director of the Washington, D.C. Office of Unified Communications. You'll probably never let me live that one down. Thank you, Karima. So, first question. What do you all see as the most promising public safety benefits for consumers from the intersection of the Internet of Things, smart cities, and NG911? And I'll open that up to anyone who wants to take it.
All right, since you forgot me.
Yeah.
I would think that just for consumers, one of the things that I get a lot in my agency, as far as complaints, is there's a lot of technology that has obviously proliferated over the years, and 911 has not kept up. And so you have these different apps. You have different ways to gather information and get that information out. But when you call 911, we're still getting information by voice. We're still asking you those questions to get the information. And so I think with next generation 911, and I've been in 911 for about 17 years now, and I remember over a decade ago when we started talking about NG911, I was so excited. I was thinking, oh my God, we're finally going to be able to get more information to our call takers when they're taking calls, because obviously when you're in an emergency, you're calling 911, you don't have all the answers. You don't remember what color shirt your child had on when they left for school, right? And so this type of having next generation where we're having video feeds and more information coming in, I think is really important, is just for the 911 center to be able to play catch up with what's already out there, and being able to be more effective and efficient when we're getting it out. And I think data is much faster than voice. And we're totally relying on voice. We're totally relying on being able to talk over the phone and get the information from you. And also the times you call 911 and you can't talk, right? If you can't talk, we really don't have any information other than your telephone number and sometimes your address. So.
Anyone else? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm really glad you started with consumers, actually. And, you know, as AT&T is out partnering with cities, we're really emphasizing citizen engagement as a key part of smart cities, because if it doesn't work for the citizens, you know, it's not going to have the support for these projects. And I think another example is getting more information to citizens. And you think about the public safety implications of whether it's sensors that are identifying an environmental issue, or obviously better traffic information that can be used. That's all convenience, but it also becomes even more critical during a public safety incidents to you know, find ways to make sure that the consumers are benefiting from that smart cities information.
I'll take the next shot. So there's something called the crash to care scenario. So if there is any incident, great example is the Boston Marathon incident a few years ago, then what happens right next time? So how to get these injured citizens back to hospital, especially the hospital that's the right set of the capabilities to care for them? That sounds like an easy question, especially with Boston, like with a lot of hospitals right there, but it's not. Literally what happened at the time was the firefighters and everybody was calling each other, literally. And there was a call center. They were dispatching the incoming calls and say, where's the hospital with the brain surgeon? Where's the hospital with the doctors who can take care of this? We believe we can do better with the right communication technology and the right public safety, all connected to transportation, energy, and all these surveillance type of applications. So that's where Smart City comes in. That's the impact to the citizens that you can tangibly see, instead of seeing all kinds of like a sci-fi space type of stories.
Yep.
Okay. First, thank you to Patrick and the NG911 Institute for inviting CTI here. We represent a good portion of the U.S. wireless industry that includes carriers and all the ecosystem players and handset manufacturers and everybody who kind of touches the wireless system. And, you know, I also want to say thank you to Representative Brooks and your Indiana small cell legislation. That was very much something that we supported, so thank you for that. You know, when we think about 911, it's something that the wireless industry has been working on in partnership with the public safety community for well over 20 years now, and we've been very successful at making 911 a key feature of wireless services. And we spent the last decade, maybe less, you know, deploying 4G technologies, and that's really revolutionized everybody's idea of what you're supposed to be able to do with communications, not just voice, but text, video, messaging, all kinds of things. And we think with the right spectrum, infrastructure, regulatory policies, 5G is going to just completely expound on that, giving you all the things that you need with low latency and high bandwidth services. That's telemedicine, that's healthcare, transportation, public safety. We talked about some of these things. And NG911 holds a similar promise. But some of the challenges that they're going to run into, we'll talk about a little bit later on the panel, are funding, governance, and technical issues. But we think that all of this is a key time for policymakers to be thinking critically, not only about NG911, but how does 5G and Internet of Things all fit into this? And I think it might be helpful to spend a few minutes talking about what is 5G from our perspective, but really kind of echoing what some of the other panels talk about on what we think are going to be what a consumer is going to see, with 5G. And the real impact I think we're going to find is in the vehicle transportation sector, where you have more just-in-time information, you have more data and sensors being utilized to make your life more convenient, but also potentially have life-saving benefits as well. Early crash warning systems and the ability to sort of, we've talked about 5G as, if 4G is trying to use those early crash detection systems to stop within 4 seconds, 5G is about doing it in real time. And so that's how critical 5G is to that type of sector, as well as you might see in the energy sector, right? Being able to be notified about outages or where lines are hot, is going to add incredible benefits to just making our energy system more efficient. So there's a lot of different opportunities here, but it's really going to be about getting the right policies now, which we're starting to see a lot of states we talked about already take this step with small cells. We spent the last 7 years building out 4G LTE to lead the world, and that took hundreds of thousands of cell sites just to do 4G LTE. We're talking about just as many cell sites, just smaller, to do 5G in almost half the time. And so we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars of investment, millions of jobs that are at stake and have an opportunity here, all with 5G and its incumbent benefits, including public safety.
So clearly we're going to see a lot more data, and I hope it's not just like a sci-fi CSI crime scene television show where everything looks amazing, but it's not realistic, because I do want to talk about how to prevent it from just being a fiction. Bill.
Just to kind of round out on what everyone else has talked about, since the topic here is NG911, Internet of Things, and safe cities, we've heard a couple different things talked about, but I think it's important to emphasize, right? I mean, I think Karima did a good job of talking about the general environment of what NG911 and its potential might be, and you heard from some of the other panelists about some of the other aspects. Specifically, when we start talking about Internet of Things and smart cities, as you saw in Patrick's opening presentation, a lot of what is being enabled, whether it's better communications with 5G, the advent of Next Gen 911, the big promise in all of this, right, what is starting to make itself felt in other verticals and is just starting to make its presence known in public safety, is this automatic and machine aspect of the topic that hopefully people got from Patrick's initial presentation. All the talk about two-way is important. My AT&T colleague emphasized that. That's very important. But what we're talking about here is not just the data necessarily that we can generate or that we might provide through other channels, but this is really about the promise of automation, right? It's a trend that's taken other verticals by storm. I can certainly provide examples ad nauseum of what this has done and how it's transformed other businesses. And the real promise that we're talking about here, right, is the importance of safe city to smart city. I won't go into who has said that, but there's a fairly prominent quote that's out in the public domain about the fact that you can't really have a true smart city without taking care of safe city first, right? So this is all about taking some of those technologies that are already operative in some of these other areas, whether it's the sensor technologies that we talked about, whether it's broadband networking, whether it's some of the data that our devices that we carry on our hip generate on a daily basis, but it's about providing a level of automation, a level of prediction. Very much like if anybody in the room is familiar with the discussions that go on ad nauseum these days about big data and analytics that you hear about in all these other sectors. It's about bringing a lot of that capability into the PSAP and into the command center. So Next Gen 911 is a foundation, 5G is a foundation. These are all necessary components, but at the end of the day, it's really about automatic data generated by non-human actors and how that can help better provide services not only to consumers and anticipating, unfortunately, some of your other questions. Perhaps this is a lead into that next one, but also providing better situational awareness for the first responders themselves.
Sure. Well, actually, that's a good segue. What I want to talk about also is, when somebody makes a 911 call, it's still primarily going to be voice calls, right? I mean, in my opinion, people are still going to dial the numbers 911 with their phone and initiate a call. But what I'm curious about is whether or not people are already starting to think about it, and will it be possible to then pull in data from, whether it's about a building that they're near, whether it's about, there's a location of a defibrillator within 100 yards because there's some other third-party database that's already out there. Are we thinking about how to, take advantage of whether it's automated or whether it's pulling data from a static database that's associated with a particular call, or are we able to pull information about that person who's making that call? And is that kind of stuff that can be shared with the responders as they respond to the emergency as well? And I'm interested in your perspective as a former fire chief on sort of how, from the responder in the field, this could work in a positive way.
Okay. So thanks, and again, thanks everybody for being here. This is hugely important for public safety, and it's great to see such a large crowd. I wasn't sure if it was that or they had lobster roll on the menu today. But the fact that Congress has already stood up a coalition to look into this, and it has so many prominent members of both the House and Senate, it really bodes well for public safety. Public safety has been the poor stepchild throughout history. This Internet of Things has been called the fourth industrial revolution by many. And if you go back to the first one, when we started having motorized vehicles, public safety didn't get the first motorized fire truck until 10 years after most people were driving around in Model Ts. So there was this, it's such a small community and their needs are so specific that they're often overlooked. You just take for granted police and fire, EMS are out there doing their job. And you figure, because every fire goes out, every crime gets solved eventually, and every person that needs medical help gets attention, you assume that they have all the tools they need. Well, I'm here to tell you they don't. And I'll give you one example of when I was a fire chief in Baltimore City, we had a lot of firefighters were getting burns because of the heat they were exposed to. The face mask would cover their face and their helmet would cover their head and the rest of their body, but their ears were getting burned. So we invested in a number of Nomex hoods that they could put on and protect their ears. And the firefighters refused to wear them. And the reason why, they said, when I go in the fire, the only sensor I have is my ears. When they blister, I know it's time to get out. So think of how desperate the situation is for public safety, that the only sensor they've had up to this point is when a part of their body burns. So the Internet of Things, or we've actually in public safety started calling it the Internet of First Responder Things, is the ability to have sensors on firefighters. Yesterday was the anniversary, 35 years we sent 3 people to the moon. And they had monitoring the entire length from Florida to the surface of the moon and back. We send firefighters in the district, they're probably out there today in a building, and the incident commander has no idea what their heart rate is, what their respiration is, if their air bottle is running out of air. So this ability to couple with industry and couple with Congress and local leaders to make sure that public safety gets access to this type of technology is just hugely important.
Anyone else? Yeah, sure.
There we go. Just as an example, right, and Ray, that was, I think, a great example of what the whole stepchild aspect of our vertical was something I was going to mention. I'm glad you got to it first. We have had that lag, right? And just to give people an example, I think it's beneficial. You heard from Ray where we're at in our vertical. I thought I'd share just very briefly, and I'm sure perhaps my NIST and AT&T colleagues may be able to elaborate on this because of the long exposure they've had to this technology. But this is an example from another vertical commercial industry. This is from 3 or 4 years ago, just to give you an example of what's capable in the space. So we're talking about copper mining in Western Australia. I won't name the vendor. People can probably look it up fairly easy. But 3 or 4 years ago, and the example was for technology transition that happened before then. People may know about open pit mining and how that works. The trucks that pick up the ore and take it different places, and the maintenance that's done on those trucks to make sure that they can continue to run, that has been completely automated and driverless and done automatically out of a command center in Perth, Australia for the mines in northwestern and Western Australia for several years now, right? The ability to move the trucks around without someone in them, to be able to do precision movements, loading and unloading, and more importantly, even to completely dispense with maintenance personnel on that particular premise, and to be able to get signals and information back from the vehicles because they're so heavily instrumented today, right? Because the cost of silicon and instrumentation and things like that, I mean, it's not only so dirt cheap that we have things on our phone that most of us don't even realize. The sensor set on any one of these devices is in the 20 to 30 different sensor ranges, and we barely use them for our everyday living. Things like trucks, cars, aircraft, ships, you name it, right? I'm using transportation examples. It's true. Someone had mentioned utilities down at the other end of the table. I don't think sometimes we understand, given we live in the environment that Ray just mentioned, just how heavily instrumented and how cheap it is to instrument and throw data off a technology system. So in these other sectors, these things are they're just done. They're done. In our capitalist society, they're about saving money or generating money, which tends to get, unfortunately, a higher priority just because of the way that we're set up sometimes. But these are the things that are possible, right? So I had a conversation just before we began the panel with a colleague of mine about where the state of Internet of Things, Safe Cities, and NG911, where that intersection is, and how much we know about it. I mean, I'm here to tell you, as probably one of the more technical people on this panel, that we've just barely begun. We have not even really scratched the surface. We do a lot of discussion, and I think we're getting very ready to try to make sure that we have policy and regulatory things in place. But before we can have a substantive discussion about policy and regulatory, and this goes back to the Congresswoman's comments earlier in the day, we need to get the technology scenarios down, and we have not even begun, other than some visionaries like Ray and other people who've been looking at how do you take these advances from some of these other sectors and apply them to what we do. I mean, if you think about that level of automation that I mentioned from the mining industry and try to get anybody in our sector to even think about that, I can't even imagine that discussion with, some of your former colleagues that run fire departments or police departments. But this is what we have to look at, and this is what we have to try and take advantage of. And the only way we're going to be able to really reap these benefits that you saw Patrick talk about from a quasi-theoretical standpoint in his presentation is that everybody that you see up here, whether it's the public safety sector, whether it's the consultants, whether it's the carriers and the solution providers like an AT&T or a Motorola, or the work that's done by a trade organization like CTIA, unless we all work together and finally really knuckle down and look at what is possible given what we can afford, what our first responders are capable of executing on, I can tell you the public is ready for whatever we can give them, right? So
I think what you just said is through automation, we're just going to have automated 911 and emergency response?
I think there's going to be more automation than probably people in the room are thinking about, right? I mean, if this is really going to be where we go, automation scenarios, we've had trouble even closing PSAPs, right? So when it's made economic sense to do so. So the idea of this kind of automation, it will be a sea change, and I'd be curious to hear what other people on the panel think, but I think this will be a big sea change mentally for our sector.
So the existence of capability is not same as broad adoption by communities. So you may have a lot of technologies, NG911, bits and pieces everywhere. There are a lot of sensors out there, and they are proven to work in many cases. Doesn't mean the communities and cities and firefighters, police chiefs are going to go out and start adopting them. So there's a huge gap. If you talk to the cities and the communities, and if you talk to the companies, there's a huge gap between them. Because primarily, private sector provides technology, but it's not necessarily their job to guarantee the safety of the citizens. That's the job of the cities and community leaders. So they're looking at two different perspectives. And frankly, that's, I think, where the federal government has a role to play, because essentially it's a deadlock situation between the private sector and the cities and communities. It's not necessarily about money. It's about building partnerships. It's about identifying best practices that's proven to be successful in a town or in a community, and identify other communities that can easily replicate those successes. So just want to make sure that NG911 and public safety, there's a huge potential, but at the same time, it's a hugely difficult task. Think about it, transportation, energy, and water, and all these different things have to all combine together. Otherwise, there's no crash to care. Because if you don't have any transportation system involved, how are you going to bring the injured citizens back to hospital? you need to involve the healthcare system in it, because otherwise, how do you identify the right hospital to bring those folks to? So we are up against a daunting task. But at the same time, this is not something that either local governments or the only companies, universities can do. It's where federal government can play a huge role.
Yeah, I certainly agree with the challenge, but I want to talk a little bit about what's the solution. And I think the good news is we're seeing cities start to take all the verticals that we've been talking about and bring them together into a holistic strategy. And that's really where the exciting things happen and where the sum is greater than the parts. And I think it's important for public safety to be at the table and to be part of the thinking from the very beginning. So just to give some tangible examples, we're working with Miami-Dade County to build a pilot program for a centralized network operations center, or NOC, that would manage all of their smart cities applications. And it would obviously make sense to have public safety in there from the beginning. That was strange. One of the key stakeholders in that process. And you think about some of the examples that we talked about. If you're doing a smart lighting solution in a city, it makes it's very easy to build in the type of sensors that you talked about, Patrick, that can then help be used for public safety. And I've seen some estimates that could help. And then you combine that with, say, the smart infrastructure, right? So not just the connected cars, but building in good traffic analysis. There are estimates that can reduce response times 30 to 50% for public safety. So they need to be at the table, and they need to be thinking about how are we going to bring all of this data together and create the use of that data for the public safety applications. But I think we're at the right time to have the discussion now, because cities are just starting to kind of pull their plans together holistically, and it's the right time to build in public safety from the beginning.
So, because we're still at the sort of blue sky portion of the panel, which I think is good, because I think as Dr. Rhee pointed out, there's a lot of challenges to how this data is going to get integrated and utilized by the public safety community. But if we can start thinking now about what the potential use cases are that we're trying to solve for, I think it helps to put a target out there of where we're going towards. So a couple of things that we think about when, where can 5G technologies be helpful in the public safety space? One is situational awareness. This was discussed already. That's a key concept in the idea of maybe, retooling a drone or some other IoT product so that it can go into that dangerous area where we may not want our public safety personnel going directly into, automatically collect information, bring it back, and then make decisions off of that to be able to better retool, allocate our public safety resources in a safe and efficient way. Another way, if you think about all the California wildfires that have been happening over the past couple of weeks, if we had sensors in the roads that could essentially talk to the vehicles, talk to the first responder equipment about, hey, a road is being closed here, you should be rerouted in this direction. Think about the impact that could have to safety, to not having to allocate public safety officials to go out to put up road barricades to close out roads because we don't, we have technology that can handle that. And yes, these are all things that, are part of the blue sky portion, but let's start thinking about the use cases now and start driving towards that target.
Krim, I'm interested in your perspective, two things. One, are you actively working with, for example, the CTO in DC? Is public safety part of the discussion, and how important is that? And second, having heard all these use cases and all the potential data sources, we do have some experience in the 911 community over the last 30 years with data, right? Whether it's from a burglary or a fire alarm or telematics data from like an OnStar or something like that.
Right.
So are there lessons learned about how to utilize that data that we can benefit from already from our past, to the limited extent we have used data? And from your perspective, is there any danger of sort of being overwhelmed by this data, and how do we think about that?
Sure. So I was sitting over here and I was jumping up in my seat hearing all of this for two reasons. The first reason is I think you mentioned that public safety has been the stepchild of a government, where 911 is definitely the stepchild of public safety. I would argue that. But I do think that all of this, listening to the conversation, I am definitely the ops person here and not the technical person here. I think, Ray, you probably have both. But all of this technology sounds great, and I think the challenges are there, and I think it's very important for it. But I think what we need to go back down to is the base of 911 is still operating off of infrastructure that is going to be 50 years old, I think you said in a month or so. I also was thinking about the data. So one of the things I thought about last night preparing for this panel was how do we bring in the data, because all of this data is well and great, and we want it and we need it, and it's something definitely needed, but we have to also think about the 911 call takers and dispatchers that are getting this data. I remember when we first started talking about text to 911, what data, and once it becomes where video is and pictures are available, do we want someone to send in a picture of a suicide to a 911 call taker? We're not mentally ready to take that type of information. We usually hear it, we pass it on to the first responders, and they're taking it. So now we're getting more into development of the 911 personnel themselves of getting the information. Being a member of NASNA, which is at the state level for the 911 administrators, I think we represent about 46 of the states, including the District of Columbia, which will soon be a state. My mayor would kill me if I didn't say that. But you have different levels of state support with NG911. I would like to say that Congresswoman Brooks, Indianapolis is definitely one of the ones, or Indiana is one of the states that does have the support, and also our NCR here, Virginia, Maryland, and DC. We're very supported by our government, our legs, and our executive branch with NG911. But that's not the story with a lot of states. Some of the stories that I hear about where they're moving, or the movement, whether it is where we are closer to over 50% with our movement toward Next Gen 911, some states haven't even started the discussion. And those states that have started any type of discussion, the 911 centers, the communications personnel are not at the table. And so I think it's very important. First, we have to start there. We have to include 911, because all this data is great and it comes in, but how do you get it to the responders? How do you get that information through to the responders? And 911, we've always been the hub of that communications, and I think it's always going to stay that way. I was looking around and I was thinking about, someone mentioned about having video come into the 911 center, and I was thinking, how cool would that be for us to have that video come in and send it out to a responder? Because right now, if something happened and I called 911 and they asked me to describe, and I said it was a white male with a suit, if you look across this room, it would be really hard, right? It would be really hard to describe that. But if I was able to send the video over to my MPD unit that's on the way, and he can actually see the person, I think that would be really helpful. And just to end, we were talking about the data coming in, how you deal with data, and that's something that myself, my chief of operations, we've been talking with our Homeland Security, which is in our building. I know a lot of 911 centers don't have that privilege, but we have a fusion center. And so talking about maybe some of that data going into the fusion center and what our PSAP need getting filtered back. And then the other option is to have the relationship with the vendors, the carriers, those that supply the data, to let us know that, 911 might not need all this data when a call comes in or a video, but we do need these pockets of information and having that relationship, so.
So moving along to that idea, I did work in the 911 center in Baltimore City, and I-83, if you had a truck accident or a fire, you would get literally hundreds of calls coming in, all for the same event. And that actually clogs the lines coming into the 911 center, and there's no way to sort through that. You can't look ahead and see, oh, this 15th call is actually a building fire, not the fire that everybody sees on the expressway. So one of the things that I'm hoping we can tap into is, I happen to have 6 grandchildren, and like most grandparents, I take a ton of pictures of them, and I use Google Pics. And so Google has an algorithm, so if I take a picture of 3 of my grandkids and their heads are going everywhere and I can't get one where they're all looking at the camera, Google has an algorithm that will actually do that for me, and it sends it to me in an email and says, here's all your faces, their best looks. So imagine if we could do that in a 911 center. Instead of getting, 500 images of a traffic accident, how about if we had an algorithm that would give you the most clear image that showed you, how many vehicles were involved, if there were any people laying on the ground, that sort of thing, so that Karima's staff isn't sitting there trying to, Jeff Wobbleton's over there trying to look through 50 images and decide which one to send to the 911 center for them to then send it out to the first responders. So besides the funding, which is critically important for this, being able to drive innovation and make sure that public safety, which there's only about 6,000 PSAPs, public safety answering points, 911 centers in the entire country. So that's not a large customer base for a corporation or a startup to say, hey, I can sell 6,000 apps. But if there's an incentive for that, or if they're driven to, it serves the community because it's public safety, they're going to save lives, folks in Congress can certainly push that locally, push it through your universities, get universities to focus on training programmers to develop public safety apps. Both Verizon and AT&T, who are represented on a panel, have done hackathons, and I've participated in that. APCO has sponsored them, and it's a terrific way to go into a room, and I tell my ears burned story, and a lot of youngsters who are brighter than most people that I've seen light up, and they say, oh my God, that's ridiculous. We can do a sensor for that. We put it on a pebble. We put it on, something on their lapel. So that's something that you all can help us with too. That's not money. It's just get to the right resources that are out there and emphasize to them that we need innovation to start focusing on public safety needs.
Since Patrick brought up data issue, I want to touch on the cybersecurity topic. The more and more data is handled through NG911, any system you're talking about a totally different world, okay? When you talk to mayor's office and the cities about cybersecurity, they always say that this is one of the #1 important topic in any kind of smart city issues they're talking about. Now I ask the second question, so what are you exactly doing to address cybersecurity issues in the cities? Most of the response is, well, we're looking into it. We have a CTO who should know better about it, that type of response. So this is a completely underserved topic from my perspective, the cybersecurity for local governments and communities. So NIST is actually, it has a huge, pretty large-scale smart city and IoT program called the Global City Teams Challenge, about 160 cities in the world and 300 companies, universities all together. Next year, we are partnering with the Department of Homeland Security to address specifically the issue of cybersecurity and trustworthiness issues in smart city deployments.
Jeff, interested in your perspective on this topic, and also I know your company and you look at the topic of big data generally. So, are there lessons we can learn? Are there benefits that can be gained from the world has nothing to do with public safety, but just in terms of, pulling all this information together, analyzing it, using it? You can almost imagine data coming into a 911 center, even information on calls and outcomes, and taking all of that data to, predict certain types of emergencies that are likely to happen, or predict injuries that are likely to be suffered by a victim of an emergency as a result of the data that's coming in about that particular. So how do we take advantage of all the data and do it in a way that is actually beneficial and, is something that the 911 call taker and the responders can actually benefit from?
Yeah, well, to start with a very obvious observation, the data is only as useful as your ability to use it and analyze it and pull it together. And I think something that all types of businesses are being challenged by is kind of getting interoperable, clean data that can, you have two different data sets, they're stored in a different way. How do you bring that together? And I think that's part of that integration that I talked about earlier, that the real key here is to have a centralized, consistent approach across the vertical solutions, right? So you can't have the public safety department on a completely different system that's not interoperable with the others, or they're not going to get the benefit of the data. So I think part of it is having that holistic view and centralized view from a technology standpoint. And then I do think that improves your ability to secure the data. One of the things we see is vulnerabilities often are created because there are pockets of within an organization doing their own thing and not taking advantage of the scale that can be gained by, applying security tools across the company and managing it consistently. So in my mind, this all comes together is you want kind of a centralized view that can both manage the data, harness it, but also protect it. And that is going to be the key to, whichever vertical you're talking about, it's going to be made even enhanced and even more valuable by being able to draw on data from other parts of your city. So I'd say what I heard today that is, really needs to be addressed is you can't have public safety as a stepchild off by itself. It's got to be, in the room in the discussion, and then it's got to be integrated interoperably with everything else that's happening.
Sure. Yeah, sure.
So maybe one of the things that I hope people have heard, I mean, I certainly have from the most recent comments from Ray on down, one of the things that I think is really important, and perhaps there's policy and regulatory pieces to this, but also just in general, hopefully the lesson that people are getting from some of this is this embracing of commercial innovation that our sector is going to need to do, right? Anybody who's been in the sector for a while, and it isn't a criticism, it's just a statement of fact, we're very used to buying solutions from specialty vendors that have focused on our sector, which is relatively small, as Ray pointed out. And so the incentive for innovation, it's not an accusation, it's just economic reality. Those incentives for innovation are relatively small. You heard Ray talk about Google, right now, which has not been a traditional supplier to our sector. Whether it's Google, whether it's someone like that, whoever it might be, there are capabilities out there that are being used by other sectors that do things that would be beneficial for public safety. Cybersecurity is another area. NIST can probably talk about a lot of what's out there in the public sector. AT&T certainly can talk about that from the solutions that they offer to businesses outside of public safety. We do the same thing at Motorola. Basically, there is a sea of capability out there that's never been exposed to our sector because we've just been, for whatever reason, very tight with a particular set of vendors. The good news is a lot of vendors are starting to cross-pollinate from other businesses that they have to bring that into public safety, but at the end of the day, I think one of the important realities of what we're talking about here, the intersection between these three technologies, is this hopefully new openness, whether that's at the contracting level, the policy level, the discussion level. It goes to exactly what we were talking about at the other end of the table, as well as down here about including public safety at the ground level, right? All these new discussions need to include public safety from the very beginning so that technology, we talked just a minute ago about 50-year-old technology. I think, again, anybody who knows the phone system in this room knows that actually the trunks and other pieces of the pie that we use for 911 are a lot older than 50 years. So it's probably older than most everybody in this room. So the time to embrace that change is now. And the good news is if we're open to that commercial innovation, there's a lot of stuff that's already available that can help us do better.
So we are open to questions from the floor as well, if folks have questions. I'll ask one more, but if anyone has questions, yes, please.
And for those, and many of you who run 911 systems, have we had cyber attacks on our 911 systems?
Yes.
I know we're constantly, firewalls are protecting, but have we actually had successful attacks in the country, and if so, where?
There's a good list, and like I said, it's not necessarily a plug for any particular event, but if you have access to the APCO Broadband Summit presentations from May of 2016, and I believe, I don't know if he's part of the NG911 Institute or not, is Secular Systems part of it doesn't matter. Well, there's a presentation there by a gentleman by the name of Tim Lorello from a company called Secular Systems that actually does a pretty good job of delineating the level, the numbers, the states, and the centers that have been hit by that. I mean, the short answer, Congresswoman, to your question is that, yes, there's been lots of attacks on public safety systems, and some have indeed been compromised already. So.
There are,
So, Congresswoman, I also wanted to add, so, yes, specifically, recently, I think it was maybe a year ago, we had a kid, and I'm gonna say he was about 19, that's a kid for me now, but a 19-year-old or around that age, send out a link via Twitter and send it to his friends. And when you click the link, what it would do is it would just inundate the 911 system with calls. And as far back as I can remember, if that wasn't the first, that had to be in the only 5 that I can remember where there was an attack that was directly to a 911 center. I'm sure we've had other cyber threats or other incidents that maybe came from something else specifically, and 911 was on the received some of it, but I think that was one of the first ones that I remember going through, and it did affect, it started in, I don't know, maybe Arizona, I think, and it ended up going across a good little bit of states. It actually affected DC also. And so depending on where the friend was, it was sent to their friend list, and every time you click this, it would just send all these calls. I know in the last year, I have also had in the district where we have saw the same type of calls come in, where they're ghost calls or they're calls, and for some reason they're coming from a certain IP address or whatever. I would also like to add that with FCC, they the TFOPA task force identified and talked a lot about this, and that's a really good thick book to read. I actually read it, David. But it talks about cybersecurity. There's a whole working group just on cybersecurity for these PSAPs, because I think that I don't know if we even have a grasp on cybersecurity at the level of 911 right now, but we know once it gets more complicated and we're talking about IP-based 911, that the cybersecurity would be even more of a topic.
So, Congresswoman, to answer your question, there are 2 very specific and high-profile cases that probably a lot of you already aware of. There was one on denial of service attack on cameras, essentially using about 500,000 cameras in the United States to attack data centers. That happened last year, I think. There was another one which is a little less profile, what happened in, I forget exactly which city, it was in Texas. Somebody hacked into the city's siren system, essentially turned on the whole siren of the city. Obviously, nobody got hurt, but it was annoying, and that showed, well, think about it. I mean, siren, all the city goes by on this. And yeah, exactly. So, but it shows that it is possible. So, and there are, I'm sure, more. That's why I think it is critical to take a look into it as intersection between the cybersecurity and local governments.
2 questions in the back. Yep.
Hi, I'm Marinos. I'm the founder of Parachute, the emergency live streaming app. And I feel like the discussion here today has been a little bit futuristic and theoretical, but we at Parachute, we've been live streaming emergencies with live video, audio, and location for 2 years now. And we have all this amazing evidence, amazing quality data, and yet when it comes to us integrating with 911 and providing them all this data in real time, we run into all these different vendors that have very closed systems that are not really made and don't really allow for openness. And so I was wondering, along with this top-down approach where we kind of mandate and we say, 911 should now have video, what about a bottom-up approach where we just simply open up all our systems on all these vendors and allow apps like Parachute to kind of feed all this data into 911 and provide it to all the PSAPs?
Anyone?
Hi. So I think just on the operation side, and someone else may want to jump in on the IT side of things, I think that I do agree we do have a lot of different systems in place that are closed circuit or not readily available and open to apps, and I think that's on purpose, and I think it's for a reason, and it's just because of the type of information we receive. And it goes back to what I was talking about how much data we actually receive in a 911 center. You're not obviously the only app that has this type of capability. We get it a lot. I know when I go to conferences and stuff, I have different, and they're really great apps, and I like the idea behind them. But I think in 911, we really have to filter what comes in. We have to have trusted data that we're sending out to our responders. And so there has to be some type of relationship when you're talking about letting in certain data. and that may be what you're getting when you're coming and asking for information to come in. And so I think that may be what we're talking about here, is how do we aggregate this data, and how do we decide what data is allowed to come into 911? What standards are these apps under? Because your app may be great and your service may be great, and then we may have one that is trying to send nefarious information or trying to harm the system. And so we have to be really careful with that. And so that's just my pick on the operations side of things.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on to that, 911 centers are just getting to the point where they can accept text, and now you're talking about video, which is way more bandwidth and requires equipment on their end to be able to get that. You don't want to have an individual operator getting it on their personal cell phone and saying, now what do I do with it? I got this video of an accident. So love the fact that you're working and focused on public safety. Dr. Reeve from NIST is actually the money man on this panel. They've given out a ton of grants to public safety-focused software development companies and universities. So you may want to, Dr. Reeve, I'm throwing you to the wolves here, but you may want to check with him after.
So one thing I think we want to avoid, though, right, is every company who has a source of information, whether it's a car company or your company or anyone else, doing individual one-off installations with 911 centers. On the other hand, I'm sympathetic to folks who are trying to connect to the 911 system, which is it is based on legacy technology, and so I'm sure there's sort of a desire to push forward wherever you can. So I think we just have to find that balance of, I'm all in favor of instigators that are trying to push the envelope, but at the same time trying to do it in a way in which it's standardized, it doesn't require one-off solutions that aren't part of the equipment that folks are using on a daily basis. And that's a challenge. Yeah, one more. Yep.
Just real quick, just as an example, and thank you for bringing that up, right? I mean, there are different processes and procedures that are operative in some commercial environments versus where we're at in public safety, but it's great that you brought up what you talked about. If I could just put a plug in for standards here, right? So I work very closely with the National Emergency Number Association and other standards development organizations. I happen to chair an organization called the ICE Steering Committee, which is the organization inside of NENA that has successfully sponsored 9 years now almost, or 8 years, of successful interoperability tests with regard to Next Gen 911. We are all about, I think everybody in the panel, for innovative companies like your own, bringing new data and new capabilities into the system. But as Karima and Ray and others pointed out, we can't just take everything. We need standards, we need filtering mechanisms, we need cybersecurity surety and a lot of things like that. Just to give you an example, though, of where we're at. So we put on a party called ICE 7 a few months ago, and nobody came, at least in your area, right? So it's a two-way street. We publicized, we talked about, we actively courted emergency applications vendors up one side and down the other, and maybe we need better channels for outward communication. But one of the, what's the word I'm looking for, goals of this test event was to test external applications versus the established Next Gen 911 standards from NENA, the so-called I3 standard, to see how someone like you and your company could provide that data to someone like Karima using the standards that we have, so it's not pandemonium like Patrick just pointed out. And like I said, one of the major thing was to attract vendors like you to the event. We had 2 people sign up, right? So I would say that the application community also needs to do their part, which is to get engaged with NENA, get engaged with APCO, get engaged with the other organizations that do this type of work. And those of us that do provide, since I also have a Motorola hat, those of us that are public safety vendors, we would welcome participation from folks like you that can bring innovation to the table, but do it according to the standards that we have already established.
Another question in the back. Yep.
Hi, yes, and you've kind of almost answered the question, but it's along the lines of this ongoing discussion. Clearly, the emergency systems are looking for ways to innovate how they function and how they receive information, and also how they put out their responses to those calls for help. Who initiates that relationship with innovation? Is it always coming from the emergency response systems to say, we're looking for information, for innovation in these areas for our systems to do this, and come and show us what you have along those lines? Or is it a two-way street where you all are initiating and then they can initiate as well? Or, where can people find information like this? Just because, like someone else mentioned, hackathons and things do take place, and it would really be more informative for people if they knew what to hack instead of coming up with, maybe something that does A and you don't need A, you need like J over there or something.
So my reaction to that question is that there are some excellent national public safety organizations that are, many of whom are in this room, from the National Emergency Number Association to the Association of Public Safety Communications Officials, APCO, to ICERT, which is another organization, the Industry Council on Emergency Response Technologies. We have links to all of those organizations on the NG911 Institute website. But all of those organizations have different efforts right now around on the technical side, like Bill was talking about. APCO has a Project 43, which is about sort of more on the operational impact of NG911. So I think those national associations are probably the best place to start. Yeah.
Just to build on that, I think one of the things about hackathons is you can do it based on a challenge on a specific issue. So I think that's a great point that, having public safety think about, what problem could be solved for you, and challenge people to challenge a specific problem sometimes is more effective than just a wide open, hey, come and innovate, and we don't know what you're going to do. And so think about it. I think it is a two-way process. That's a really good point.
Yeah.
Go ahead. So I just want to make a couple points on this question, and then go back to the prior question, because it was, why don't we take a more of a bottom-up approach to getting new technologies into the public safety system? And there's two issues here. One is we have an expectation that 911 is going to work the same wherever you are, whenever you're calling, however you're calling. And that isn't necessarily the case. We have a very large country with a lot of different capabilities. And one of the challenges that we face is that we've got 6,000 911 call centers that are out there. They're operating generally independently and completely subject to local support, local funding. And so, we have this inverse relationship where we have we have an expectation from the consumer side where I call 911, it's going to work the same on my phone, no matter where I am, how I'm using it. And the FCC sets certain regulations. But just because the industry adopts a solution, for example, text 911, doesn't necessarily mean that you snap your fingers and it's in the 911 system. We are, for example, with text 911, 3 years into the FCC nationally mandating this as a service, and we've got the number of PSAPs covering about 25% of the population that have adopted it. That's great because we've got PSAPs that are accepting text, but it's not but we have this service being nationally available for 3 years, and we don't have it nationally available across the country. And these are just the realities of the system that we have. So I think some of the challenges can be addressed by better coordination at the state level among the public safety community in terms of where resources are to sort of do it more uniformly at the statewide level, as well as we have a situation with funding in this country where we're paying in about $2.5 billion per year to fund the 911 system, and the FCC is routinely reporting that there are a number of states and localities that are raiding those funds, using them for other things. We got I think over the last few years, $400 million that was diverted from 911 to go to other things. So if we're going to adopt all these new technologies, do all the great things we're talking about, we've really got to get that side of the equation streamlined, coordinated, and well-funded.
And that is one of the reasons that the NG911 Institute exists, is to raise awareness of these issues, because the Congresswoman was correct that all of this is very much locally and state-driven. But at the same time, there is a federal role here, and that's why the caucus exists, that's why the National 911 Office exists, which is to say, how do we make sure this is done so that we don't end up with a Swiss cheese of communities that are able to take advantage of these things, and others within the same state even don't have the same capability, which, to your point, is what we want to avoid. Yeah.
So I actually wanted to ask a question of the group. Is anyone here represent the state of Nevada? Hands? I don't see any. Okay, the reason I ask that is the National Governor Association just this past weekend met in Rhode Island, and Governor Sandoval from Nevada has become the chair for the new session, and he's made his priority, the chair's initiative, staying ahead of the curve, trying to get states to be ahead of the curve, particularly with a focus on energy and transportation. Well, actually 911 and Next Generation 911 on the federal side falls under the Department of Transportation. So it would be great if Governor Sandoval and the representatives from Nevada could get a meeting together with APCO and NENA and some of the other organizations that are trying to push this Next Generation 911 and see if they could roll that into the NGA initiative that Governor Sandoval is starting.
Question? Yes.
I'm Cheryl Kagan. I'm the senator for Gaithersburg and Rockville, and NIST is in my district. I have been working on 911 issues for the last 3 years, and I have had 2 constituents die when 911 failed. Tomorrow, and the timing, Patrick, thank you, the timing on this gathering is perfect because I'm chairing a hearing tomorrow in Annapolis on 911 issues. And one of the key issues that we all have to face, the reality, is funding challenges. So we all know that the demand is going up, the revenue is either staying flat or going down. So I had a bill, a big omnibus bill last year that I brought in, and the question of where to get the money from when we've got bipartisan struggles on budget realities, and people aren't excited, especially in an election year, about voting for anything that looks like a fee increase or a tax increase. So I've talked about closing the loophole on the family plan. You used to pay $1 a month per each phone line, and suddenly you can have lots of phones and you're still paying $1 a month, which is not okay. So I've tried to sell it as loophole closing. Let me just ask one other question. So first off, I would love any insights on funding issues, because we can't move forward to next gen unless the money is there. And again, we've lost 2 years. We're moving forward at a glacial pace. Karima talked about, Virginia's moving forward, Fairfax County is moving forward. Montgomery, one of Maryland's jurisdictions has text to 911 right now, and that's Frederick County because it's the home of the Maryland School for the Deaf. The rest of us are vulnerable because we're right here next to DC, and we don't yet have that. So one question is, any suggestions on how we can find fees or revenues that is palatable, other than the obvious people die when 911 fails? And the second question is, how can I, as a legislator, have confidence, with all due respect to you all, that we are actually getting the revenues that we're due on those $1 a month from all of the cell phone providers, from the cards that are sold at gas stations, from the burner phones and all that? And I'd love to know what sort of accountability and how you would suggest that legislators get some idea of whether the revenue stream is coming in appropriately and whether there might be some untapped dollars that would help us move forward. Thank you.
So I'll let these folks collect their thoughts. A couple things I would say about that. One is, we have been historically funded as, it's a fee-based funding model. There's some general revenue, of course, but on the technology side, it is a fee-based model. This whole discussion raises interesting issues about what devices, what services, what fees, right? Because it was easy when it was just a wireless phone and a landline phone. So that's one interesting policy issue to grapple with. And then in terms of, sort of how you sell it, as you asked, there's going to be an initial uptick in costs to get NG911 deployed everywhere. I mean, the FCC puts out a report annually on exactly the issue you're talking about, which is how much money is collected and what is it used for. And of the roughly, I think it was about $2.5 billion that was collected the last time they released a report, I think less than 10% of it was self-identified as being spent on Next Generation 911. And the reason is because the legacy system's not going away right now. You still have to pay for what you have, right? And and the reason I bring that up is initially there's going to be this need for an infusion of capital to get that system upgraded while you're still maintaining the legacy system. So you're going to have some increased costs up front, but there's definitely going to be long-term benefits, not just on the capabilities, but I think arguably there's going to be benefits on the cost-saving side as a result of moving forward with Next Generation 911. And so while you may need additional funds to get over that hump to Next Generation 911, down the road, I think it's very likely that you will see cost savings associated with maintaining that system, not just the system itself, but also as a result of, the benefits that we talked about in terms of whether it's lives saved, improving efficiencies, et cetera. It's a hard discussion to have as you're articulating, but I do actually think that making the investment now will have some benefits down the road, which is something that everybody needs to keep in mind. But others on the funding issue.
So,
Yeah, so I could definitely add to that. I think that just to start from your last question, one of the things that we've started doing here in the district is just that. So we started having an audit of our 911 fund revenue. I think a lot of agencies and a lot of jurisdictions have done that to make sure that we're getting the revenue that's due 911. The other thing is with fee diversion, the district, thankfully, we do not divert any fees. All of it come to our agency and is responsible for 911, but it only takes up about 30% of my budget. The rest of my budget is local funding. I would also add that we started our NG911 process, but the 911 fees, being that they're already taking care of 20% of my budget, wouldn't have been sufficient enough for me to start NG911. So the district had to be creative, and we actually used capital planning and capital number money to start NG911. You do have across the states different jurisdictions that are having funding issue, which is why they haven't even started the talks of NG911. It's not there. The 911 office, which we're all, I think every jurisdiction is waiting on them. They have a small grant, and I say small because it's very relative. But you have so many hands that are waiting on this grant to open up. It's not going to be enough. I think collectively, definitely through my talks with other 911 state level administrators, the need for a federal level grant, and I think, Patrick, this is what you were talking about, just to kickstart the development of this infrastructure is definitely needed. And not to mention the continuation of just having it for years to come. And that's just something that we don't have there. We barely can get by day-to-day operations with the 911 fees that we have now. And so I think that most jurisdictions would say that they are getting most of the money through the 911 fee. And those that don't, I've heard a lot that they're starting audits and making sure that we're able to get that money. And the other thing I want to mention was TFOPA again. There was one of the working groups also actually talked about just that funding. And so it was really great to read about the different funding mechanisms or the different ways that we're trying, again, to be creative to collect funds for NG911. So that's also in that document.
So I guess I'll jump in real quick. So first of all, as a graduate of Wooten High School, thank you for your representation of our community. But what you're raising is a very challenging issue. What is it that we need for funding for NG911? We know we need sustainable funding to make that happen. But there are a number of studies that have been conducted over the years that have never come down to an exact conclusion on what it is that we need to do to upgrade to NG911. And certainly we've been supportive of that. I think in terms of the local community's support of text 911. I wonder what really are the issues there, whether it's funding, whether it's operational issues. We've seen communities that have had a lot of success, even potentially with limited funding, adopting text 911 by, implementing solutions through TTY or implementing solutions through, different options for getting text 911 into the PSAP. Our industry collects from consumers $2.5 billion per year. That's a lot of money today. And we want to make sure that money is being spent on 911 services. To the extent that NG911 costs more or maybe is more efficient, we should really be looking hard at that. But consumers are already paying a lot to support the 911 system today. We want to make sure those dollars are being used to upgrade our 911 system appropriately.
So we've hit the 1:45 mark, so I want to wrap up the panel. I think this has been a great discussion. I want to thank all of you for being here and for the great questions from the audience as well, and of course, Representative Brooks. So a couple things that I've heard are, one, we need to make sure that the infrastructure, underlying infrastructure is in place, that it's funded, and that we're accelerating as quickly as possible. On the 911 side, on the emergency communications public safety agency side, and also making sure, as the Congresswoman talked about it, that everyone has access to wireless and wired broadband connectivity that can actually take advantage of these networks wherever you live in the country. And then I've also heard that public safety and 911 needs to be at the table from the beginning, working with their city governments and working with industry, so that public safety is not something that comes on as an afterthought later, but that it's part of the discussion from the beginning as we look at smart communities and as we look at the Internet of Things and 5G as it gets rolled out. And these are very important issues. And as we do all that, thinking about what are the use cases? What does public safety want? What is the optimal outcome for consumers, and making sure that we have that infrastructure in place and we're thinking in advance about how to take advantage of the possibilities. And there's certainly going to be challenges, there's no doubt about it. But if we start from the beginning thinking about how to work together to achieve that success, that's going to be the most likely the way that we succeed. So I want to thank all of our sponsors who make these events possible. We couldn't do this without you. And I want to thank all of our speakers. Please join me in giving them a round of applause. Thank you very much.